The JU-87 wasn't just another bomber, it was a musical orchestra that struck fear into the hearts of the Allies. With its Trumpet of Jericho, it meant that hell was about to rain down, and shortly after, the Blitzkrieg followed. But only a handful of JU-87s would return home, begging the question, was the Stuka really that effective, or just a tool for psychological warfare? This is the terrifying truth about the Stuka Siren. September 1st, 1939. The Germans are mobilizing, sitting on the Polish border, waiting for orders to attack. A large force consisting of tanks, mechanized infantry, and soldiers is ready to storm Poland and open up what would become the Second World War. Yet, before any ground force would make contact, the Germans deployed the Junkers JU-87 Stuka with one goal: destroy Polish demolition charges fixed to rail bridges over the Vistula. But this wouldn't just be any bombing raids. The pale blue sky of the morning was quickly swarmed by more than 300 JU-87A and B models flying toward their target before making a dive motion that triggered their siren. The Stuka unleashed its terror, bombing Polish forces. Before a swarm of German troops marched into position and unleashed a Blitzkrieg, the kind which Europe had never seen, starting the deadliest war of the 20th century. But the JU-87 wasn't just a bomber designed for the Second World War. In fact, by the time the war started, it was already somewhat outdated, slow, with limited armor, and vulnerable to enemy fighters. In fact, the Stuka was born in 1935, but not as a novel concept. It was the German answer to the Royal Naval Air Service, RNAS, Sopwith tabloid, which proved deadly during the First World War. Even then, it would be the United States under Lieutenant L.H.M. Sanderson who first formalized and perfected the technique during the 1920s. Realizing the efficiency and accuracy of dive bombing, the Germans set out to design a dive bomber of their own. But unlike those created by the Allies, the Stuka was not only a weapon of destruction, but one that focused as much on psychological warfare as it did the physical.
But when you have a siren howling, it is must be, I haven't experienced it down, must be psychologically overwhelming.
Known as Larmgerät by the Germans, the mounted ram air sirens would be turned on each time the bomber went down to strike its target, and while they had no impact other than making noise, they quickly became one of the greatest German propaganda tools. In fact, the tactics early on in the war, especially during the invasions of Poland, the Netherlands, Norway, and France, were simple. Stukas were mounted with 550-pound bombs. They'd take off from nearby airports, flying in tight formations, while being protected by other German fighters. Once the target was located, the Stuka dived down at an angle no greater than 70 degrees, yet some pushed it to 90 degrees before launching its bombs along with the siren and pulling back up. German armor would quickly advance on the target using Blitzkrieg tactics, and within a few short hours, or even minutes, they'd destroy the enemy or force them to surrender. The dive bombing tactics at the time were the most accurate way of dropping bombs. As with each diving motion, the pilot eliminated the risk of wind and other elements affecting the trajectory of the bomb, which meant far more accurate strikes. It was the only bomber in the early war that could effectively do this without exceeding the maximum speed. And this was largely thanks to Hugo Junkers, who designed the remarkable yet simple underwing dive brakes. In fact, it was just small curved metal plates that generated drag to help stabilize the aircraft during its descent, while the precision release system would arc the bombs in a way that made them avoid the propeller and transformed it into a flying sniper rifle. The Stuka immediately became one of the most feared weapons of the war, creating panic in the hearts of soldiers and often forcing them to surrender with overwhelming force. But its power and dominance on the battlefield quickly came to an end. For the pilots using the Stuka, nerves of steel were an understatement. The Stuka had a small window in the floor, but this wasn't for anything other than to give the pilot visuals on the target. Before the diving motion, the pilot rolled the JU-87 over on its back, before pulling positive Gs to dive the plane down and reach a diving speed of 350 miles per hour. When close enough, the bombs were released, before the pilot narrowly avoided the ground and pulled on the brakes to level it out once again. An automatic brake was added as a safety feature, automatically triggered after releasing its bombs, pulling up to 6G to prevent the Stuka from hitting the ground. Unfortunately, Many pilots and rear gunners blacked out during this process, while some crashed due to target fixation and releasing the bombs too late. While all of this was going on, the sirens screamed into action to spread more psychological distress. But pilots quickly realized that these sirens were increasing aerodynamic drag by up to 10%. Many pilots became frustrated with the noise, which often caused disorientation, and the combination of negative effects on the speed meant that the sirens were removed. However, they also lost their effect on the enemy, with fewer and fewer people focusing on the sirens and more trying to shoot the thing out of the air. By 1940, during the Battle of France, many of these sirens were removed, and by the time the Germans tried to invade Britain, the Stuka Siren was a thing of the past, and its battlefield advantage slowly disappeared. As the Battle of Britain kicked into high gear, the Stuka, now without its sirens, had limited early success. Not only did it sink 4 freighters in the English Channel, but it followed it up by sinking the anti-aircraft ship HMS Foylebank in Portland Harbour. Yet as the battle raged, the Royal Air Force studied the Stuka, finding weaknesses in its attack, and after deploying its fighters, the Stuka would face some of its biggest losses. What the British learned was that following the Stuka during a dive was essentially useless. Instead, the Stuka was at its most vulnerable the moment it pulled up from a dive after releasing its bombs. So, the Royal Air Force waited, striking as each Stuka pulled back up, resulting in the loss of more than 50 JU-87s during the first 6 weeks. It was one of the most vulnerable aircraft to enemy fighters, being unable to effectively respond, and while the Bf-109 often escorted the Stukas, they had a few problems of their own, often having to peel out of formation, leaving these bombers completely exposed. Losses became so bad that most JU-87s were redeployed to Poland, where they'd await orders for the impending invasion of the Soviet Union. The Germans decisively lost the Battle of Britain, and more than 100 Stukas were either destroyed or damaged, completely taken out of the war. When Operation Barbarossa kicked off, the Stuka was once again thrust into the front lines, where it had a massive effect. Using the same Blitzkrieg tactics that proved useful during the initial phase of the war, JU-87s quickly deployed to take down Soviet armor. Moreover, they downed more than 1,500 Soviet aircraft before they could even take to the sky. For the Germans, it felt like the Stuka was once again back and would this time assist on the Eastern Front. But when the Soviets withstood the early onslaught, the tide of battle was about to turn, specifically around the Battle of Kursk. The Soviets realized that overwhelming the Stuka with superior fighter numbers, particularly the Ilyushin Il-2 Shturmovik, would render it almost useless. By the time the war ended, of the more than 5,700 JU-87s produced by the Germans, more than 3,500 would fall by the hands of the Soviets. But one German ace pilot would single-handedly take down more than 500 Soviet tanks before the collapse. Hans-Ulrich Rudel is one of the most decorated pilots in history, and this doesn't only include the Second World War. His journey began in 1939 as a long-range reconnaissance pilot over the skies of Poland, where he fed back information to the Luftwaffe. However, by 1941, he had enlisted for Stuka training, eventually earning his stripes and being deployed to Poland for Operation Barbarossa. Serving with 1 Staffelsturzkampfgeschwader 2, his first mission involved attacking the Soviet battleship Marat in the Baltic Sea, which resulted in its sinking thanks to a 2,200-pound bomb. But this was just the start of what would become one of the greatest stories of any ace pilot in the Second World War. Along with his gunner, Erwin Henschel, Rudel continued terrorizing the Soviets, flying more than 1,400 sorties together, with July 12, 1943, proving to be one of the most prestigious days of his career. He destroyed 12 Soviet tanks in just a single day during the Battle of Kursk, earning him one of many Knight's Cross awards, one which was personally presented by Adolf Hitler himself. But in February 1944, Rudel came close to losing his life, being forced to make an emergency landing behind Soviet lines. The two men attempted to swim across the Dniester River, where his gunner, Henschel, unfortunately drowned during the ordeal. Yet this didn't stop him, with Troop Doctor Ernst Gademann taking over as the new gunner. The two flew over 1,000 missions together, while striking even more fear in the Soviets, who'd lost over 500 tanks at the hands of one single pilot by the end of the war. Rudel was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with golden oak leaves, swords, and diamonds, becoming the only person to earn the award, which was supposed to be given to heroes following the war. By 1945, Rudel flew another mission, being badly wounded in his leg and landing inside German lines. His leg was amputated, but just 1 month later, in March of 1945, he he once again flew his JU-87, destroying even more Soviet tanks, and even though it was never confirmed, he is one of the last people to see Hitler before the end of the war. Rudel flew his plane from Prague, where he landed in US-controlled territory and turned himself in. The Americans refused to hand him over to the Soviets. He settled in Argentina before returning to Germany, where he passed away following a stroke on December 18, 1982. Till this day, Rudel is the most decorated pilot to ever fly an aircraft, having completed a massive 2,530 missions and managing to survive them all. He will forever be remembered as the man who single-handedly destroyed more than 500 Soviet tanks with little more than a simple biplane. But as controversial as the Stuka was, it was supposed to be protected by the German Bf-109. However, it failed its mission numerous times due to its own flaws. Check out this video to find out why.